All right. This ain't just going to be fire. It's going to be like Firaga. Okay, fire up the Lenovo.
It's not my fault Dardoch got
Okay, here we go.
jungler.
Dignitas has proven that you can, in fact, look decent even with an all-NA roster that was created with balance in mind and not just some roster looking to save a couple bucks, as we've seen within North America, at least this year, and teams have even admitted as such. Now, I'll add that anyone that does create a roster like this that Dignitas has obviously doesn't have winning the entire split in mind, right? Like let's not go that far and like praise Dignitas as like, oh, they might be able to win the split or whatnot. But I think Dig can be happy with their results, even if they were to drop out right now, even if they lose in the first round of the losers bracket. I think you can go out and say that, yeah, Dignitas actually did pull more weight than everyone thought initially to begin with. So I think they have every right to say that, yeah, they did a great job as an organization and as a coaching staff itself, which is why I think they deserve coaching staff of the split. Because I think when you just look at this from the inception of how the organization maybe decided how to put this roster together fundamentally, the roster has very clear strengths, right? You have a veteran shot caller, in Afromu, right? Who is someone who has raised multiple ADCs at this point. We might as well fucking call him like the ADC whisperer, you know what I mean? Like it's clear that they went into this roster knowing that Afromu could bring a rookie under his tutelage, teach him a couple fucking things, and maybe develop someone into a superstar. Now, obviously, with that said, obviously Neo has to have some kind of innate skill to begin with for Afromu to, kind of nurture. And I think that is happening, and we're seeing in ADC, a good ADC being birthed right before our eyes, kind of in that sense. So you have that piece along with just a blunt jungler, right? Like everyone knows that Dardoch will tell you how it is, to what he believes is the idea of how he wants to play the game or whatever. And so you have this combination between those two, someone that is the tutor and someone that is a little bit more harsh, a little bit more heavy-handed. And then you got the two rookies in the solo lanes that can kind of learn from them. And now here's where things get a little bit murky, because usually solo lanes are reserved for imports, right? Because those are the players that can make the most impact throughout the entire game without having to rely on anyone else, right? So you don't really need a whole lot of communication or whatnot. You just kind of win the lane on your own, and then that carries and snowballs over into everything else. So the construction of this roster certainly had some risks. Let's not say that it didn't, but I think at least there's a fundamental theory that everyone can see and be like, okay, yeah, I get the logic behind all of that. So let's discuss some of the players here, because one of the big hot topics at the very beginning of the construction of this was Dardoch, of course, whom many thought didn't deserve a second chance after TSM, which, by the way, is kind of rich coming from TSM fans who hate every single one of their junglers, I guess not named Spica, even though, Spica is now technically the old guard, I guess, for TSM itself, which maybe is the reason why they don't fucking hate Spica at this point. But okay, yeah. But Dardoch, it's clear that he had his troubles with the other teams and whatnot. He was like screwed over by TSM kind of, and like he just didn't gel with TSM itself, or rather the system that they had over there. And that is presumably because he didn't have as much liberty as he would have liked, as much freedom as he would have liked. And the team, at least Dignitas now, is clearly built around him and Afromu. And I like that dynamic, right? There is like the sage, right? And then there's like the warrior, right? This is like Athens and Sparta, I guess you could say, right? Like they make a really good fucking partnership when you think about it. That's why Rome was so successful, aside from the fall of it. Maybe we might see that in the future. Who knows? But Dardoch, I think, works perfectly with rookies. If you just think about it fundamentally, and Dardoch's problems in the past with other players is that he's always had to butt heads with people that are veterans or people that demand a certain amount of respect because of their accolades and you know their namesake and whatnot. Well, that really doesn't exist within Dignitas, right? It's him and Afromu, right? And I think he can kind of juggle that and see, and especially just him growing as a person, he can see that there's a type of necessity for some of that, but also now he is actually one of the leaders of the team, which he has never been in really any of his teams, if you think about it. So for me, I think this is a great kind of redemption arc for Dardoch, and I think the coaching staff uses him perfectly, as he clearly has a lot of control, even with his picks. He's had like 11 unique picks, so it's clear that he has a lot of decision making when it comes to the draft, when it comes to the play style, and how the team plays around him, in fact, and how everyone makes fun of the whole level 1 plays that Dignitas does, because it's all centered around Dardoch's jungle and limiting invades and things like that. So the coaching staff realizes that if you give Dardoch a long leash, he won't want to bite you, essentially, right? Because he chokes himself running after something normally when he has a short leash. So if you give him a long one, he's not going to have that happen, or at least it's less likely. And I mean, I guess that goes with the whole adage of that junglers are dogs, right? No, I'm just fucking, but I think it's quite apt as far as Dardoch's long leash is concerned. But I think the coaching staff had realized this, and had realized that Dardoch actually needs a lot of freedom, and they've given that to him. And so you can see the fruits of that result, I guess. Now, when it comes to, I guess, Afromu, right? Because this is the opposite scale, right? This is the Athens to the whole Roman Empire. He's the calming voice, right? He's the aristocrat, you could say. And I just want to highlight, in a Dignitas interview by a guy named Real Zesty, I think I'm remembering that right, is Dardoch even explained that there's a good cop, bad cop dynamic between the two, and that, obviously Dardoch is the bad cop. He gives all the big criticism, and, he's kind of the asshole. But then Afromu comes in, and, he says, like, hey, everything's all good. Like, don't take it so seriously. Dardoch just meant it this way. And, like, he is right. He didn't approach it correctly, but, let's reframe that, and, let's work on actually what he wants you to work on. And I think that's that's perfect and exactly what you want in between two teammates. Is you do want a good cop, bad cop scenario. Usually it is between the actual players on the team and the coaching staff. Oftentimes the coaching staff will take on a good cop, bad cop dynamic. It'll be like the strategic coach, and then, the regular coach, or right, like the head coach and the assistant coach. Maybe the assistant coach will be a little bit more hard-headed and more harsh upon the players, but then you could always talk to the head coach, and he'll just explain it in a different way, and maybe be more empathetic towards, whatever grievances that you have. So Afromu can, be that guy to pull Dardoch back and say, when he's getting a little bit out of line, right? Or maybe he just takes the sting out of Dardoch's criticism. And I think that is the perfect dynamic to set this entire team up. And I don't think that you can go in and say that that is solely because of Dardoch and Aframu themselves. I think it was set up, and obviously the setting is in place by the coaching staff themselves. And also, can we just see that Aframu seemingly does have a way with diffusing rough characters, right? I mean, like Doublelift, Dardoch, well, I guess that's it. But I think those two, let's just call them big personalities for this sake, is a good indication that he's like fucking lavender tea compared to like 5 tequila shots, right? Like he's clearly the calm, cool, and collected voice that is needed within the fucking rambunctious party that is Dignitas itself. So I think that is the perfect balance, and I think that in some ways has to be enabled by the coaching staff themselves. And essentially, the coaching staff have allowed the players to help coach the rookies and create the structure around it to support them and to have that kind of system flourish, right? I think some of the best ways, or at least one particular way of setting up your coaching staff, or rather your coaching structure, is to allow the players themselves to coach themselves and kind of be, I guess, self-productive. And you just kind of facilitate that and give them the room in order to do so. And I think that's essentially what's happening here, and I love how essentially this team's play style is all about team fight, scrappy brawls, like going in seemingly with reckless abandon and almost following on a whim, right, of just Dardoch calling like, yo, let's go now, let's jump on this. You can even see it just from a spectator's point of view. You could see that they follow on Dardoch's initiations like 100%, and they believe in all of his shit. So I like that style. I like the style that Dignitas have developed of just this scrappy team that they might not do the perfect macro plays, or they might not set up for an objective well or vision well or anything like that, and that's certainly areas in which they can improve on. And I think for North America's sake, yes, that is actually going to work because there just aren't players mechanically skilled enough or macro skilled enough in order to fight against something like Dignitas' style. But for the time being, and for developing players and for just kind of getting everything set to where you actually are comfortable doing team fights over and over again, or skirmishes over and over again, this is a good basis to lay down, and then you could start working on the harder things like macro and whatnot. And then on top of that, I just think Saligo and Fake God have looked the most confident they've ever been. And I think you can attribute that to coaching staff, and you can attribute that to the veterans that are kind of helping them throughout this entire spring split. I just think it's a great marriage in that sense, right? So as far as the coaching staff, I just want to point out a couple characters. Invert specifically, the assistant coach, has always struck me as a guy who cared about amateur players. He coached Collegiate, he coached FlyQuest Academy, and if you remember, he got brought up because of St. Vicious's untimely, controversial takes, and so he had to fill into FlyQuest's main team as a coach. So he's always had this eye for developing rookie talent, as it were, obviously, like famously JJ, for instance, and whatnot. So I just think that, overall, this is one of the perfect coaches in order to get on your coaching staff if you want to try and develop rookies. Jimmy Harrison, I think, is another person who was a two-way player coach within Golden Guardians, and he seems to have some effect, right? He's kept his head down after an unfortunate interview with me, where he got flamed by the community. But obviously he's had some effect, and having worked previously with Deathly, who was looking good in Golden Guardians, then seems to have fallen back into his old habit somewhat, over in Evil Geniuses. But I think Jimmy Harrison, in combination with Invert, and how they are both player development coaches in a sense anyways, right? Because they've worked with a lot of rookies and whatnot. I think that's a recipe for like magic, and like, I mean, speaking of fucking magic, like, can we just side tangent off over to Fiflarn? I don't know if many know who this guy is, but he's an old school Counter-Strike 1.6 player, played in NOA, very famous team. I was watching this fucking guy when I was a kid back in the day, and he played in CSGO, won multiple majors, and created a dynasty with Ninjas in Pajamas, and is now VP of esports for Dignitas. So like, I'm not attributing Dignitas's North American LCS success to him. But I just find that what's kind of funny is that Fiflarn was known as a support player. So I don't know if that's a trend that support players create like the best coaches or upper management or whatever. I don't know. Might be something to look into. Overall, I'm very impressed with how Dignitas are basically just one of the few lower teams that have stuck to a style, ran with it, developed their players significantly, and kind of held on to those players and held on to the play style that they initially had presumably thought of in the beginning, with marked improvements, and also in some ways rehabilitated their veteran players to become better versions of their previous selves. So overall, I just think that entire package is what makes them the best coaching staff by far. They certainly, weren't working with gold. They had to kind of shine up some players and, polish out the rough edges. And that's truly what makes a good coaching staff, though. What's attributed terribly to coaches, I think, is the idea that they created a player, right? They just suddenly made a player super great, right? And I think like it's because people attribute that to, well, if this player is performing really good, then therefore the coaching staff must have had some major part in that, right? And I don't think you can necessarily attribute the player's skill kind of one-to-one directly with the coach. It's not that at all. I don't think there's a base skill that each player has, and you can only try to maximize it. That's all that a coaching staff actually is, in fact. And you can only try and bring out the inner genius of that player. Maybe they do need to go back to the fundamentals. Maybe they do need to work on their three-point shot, and you have to actually change fundamentally how they shoot the ball. And so they're shittier in the very beginning as you try and rework them, but then they become to an even greater player than they ever were before. And whether that is young or old as a player, it's kind of always been there to begin with, the whole innate skill. But it takes a truly good coach to show that player that they have always had more they can put on the table to become better. And I believe that Dignitas have done that this split.